Good evening, Lactobacillus acidophilus and Helicobacter pylori. My name's Danny. This is my own worst enemy, mental health podcast. Not really got anything of interest to relay this week, I'm afraid. Been a bit of a quiet one. Well, not quiet, because kids are off school, or have been off school, so definitely not quiet, but uneventful. In fact, I'll tell you what, even though Roman's gone back to school today, and it's still not quiet, so I've got... Can you hear this, right? Next door neighbour, he's piss farting about, banging about. I don't know if you can hear this. Right, yeah, that's not annoying when you're trying to record a podcast. Got the baby, she's going mental downstairs. You can probably hear this as well. Hang on. It's also the sound of my other half being very considerate as well while I'm recording. Playing trap music or whatever it was she was listening to. What was I saying? I don't even know what I was up to. That was it. So, because it's been a bit of an uneventful week, what I usually like to do with these intros is try and come up with something that's happened that sort of ties in to the topic of the day. But because there hasn't been anything, I just thought I'd sort of throw some random anecdotes at you just to fill the time. So, first one is Roman at the Science Museum the other day. He went and... You've got to be shitting me. This is my mum ringing. Hello? 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 Brilliant. Can you hear me? Look, if you can hear me, ring me back. If not, I'm putting my phone on silent. So you've got 30 seconds. So chop chop. Alright, try that again. Hello?
Hello.
Go on.
I said, can you do me a massive favour? The bloody bulb's gone in the toilet. So it's pitch black in there. You can't see where you're walking. But it has to be screwed off the ceiling, the shade, to put the bulb in, and then has to be screwed back up again.
Right, okay.
And normally Adam does it for me, but he's not going to be home till 6 o'clock tonight.
Right, and you can't hold in having a shit until 6 o'clock.
I can't. I've taken the bloody water tap. I'm going to piss in toilet every 5 minutes.
Right, well,
If you can't do it, love, don't worry.
No, I can.
I'll have to wait till tonight.
No, I'll do it. I'm in the middle of recording the intro for the podcast, so
Right, okay.
I'm going to get that recorded, and then I'll head to yours. So, I'll be there in about, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes.
Oh, that's fine. Don't rush.
Right.
I'll have to hang after. Leave the bathroom door open while I go for a slash.
Right. Okay.
All right, love. Thanks, love.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. Jesus. Right. Where was I? I was just saying. It's been an uneventful week. Mind you saying that standard practice, that sort of thing. What was I going to say now? Oh yeah, Roman. I can't even be bothered now. Roman ran into it. It was at a restaurant at the Museum of Science and Industry the other day, and he ran into a glass door head first, and now he's got like a bump on his forehead. Looks like he's turned into a unicorn. I was just going to sort of spin that out into some sort of elaborate anecdote, but I've lost all enthusiasm. Actually, so here's one, right? Little hearsay anecdote for you. My mum just reminded me. So, right, for all the American listeners, of which 60% of you are American listeners, apparently, which always surprises me. But if you guys have ever wondered about the social dynamics of the fabled British council estate, This following little anecdote tells you everything you need to know. So, my mum's mate's having a barney with one of her neighbours who lives a couple of doors down because they've robbed her house while she was like out at a charity event or something. And but she's got no CCTV, right? And she ain't got any witnesses, right? So you think, well, how does she know it's them that's robbed her? Well, guess what they stole? Her Christmas tree and all the decorations, right? Bearing in mind it's still October, but then still you think, well, how does she know? How does she know that they've stolen a Christmas tree? Well, rather than sell it, yeah, put it on eBay or whatever, they've put it up. They've put her Christmas tree up in their window with all the decorations on it in October, right? And then continued to deny any knowledge of this incident. But then, rather than tell the police, yeah, and sort it out that way, what the two of them have done instead is set up fake profiles on Twitter to send each other abuse online. So, yeah, there you go. Again, it sounds quite eventful, right? But if you live in the middle of a council estate like my mum does, standard. I'll tell you what happened, right? Well, right, I'm on a roll now. A few weeks ago, right, my Uncle Roy, he has a bit of a frog in his throat, right? Goes to the hospital for a scan. They tell him he's got throat cancer, yeah, riddled with it. Said you've got about 12 months to live by the looks of things. So, yeah, tell him to go home and sort of get his affairs in order. So he does. He goes home, rings around everyone, tells his kids and everything. My mum's devastated. And, yeah, because them two are like proper close. Anyway, the other day, oh God, this really isn't going well. You all right out there? I'm just going to come out and... Hi. This has been a disaster. This has been the noisiest intro to a podcast I've ever done. You're on. Being recorded, by the way. Nothing to say. I've had babies, dogs, you playing your trap music or whatever it was down there. The neighbours piss farting about, banging on the fence out there. My mum's rang in the middle, says the bulb's gone in a bathroom, so she can't have a piss, so I've got to go up there and change a bulb for her. And then you come creeping upstairs, and you know I can't perform when I've got people in the vicinity. So, what have you got to say for yourself?
Nothing.
Right. I'm going to crack on. I'm going to finish.
I've got a baby. You have to deal with it.
I don't know. What was supposed to be a quick 5-minute intro with me just saying, I haven't really got anything to tell you. Chuck a little anecdote in there for 2 minutes and, you know. And where was I? I can't not finish another anecdote. What was I talking about now? Oh, my Uncle Roy. So he's been told he's got 12 months to live. He's got throat cancer. He goes around, tells everybody. Anyway, goes to see a specialist the other day. They say, yeah, it's cancer, but it's not too bad. We'll get that whipped out. No problem. You'll be fine. So imagine that. And which, again, sounds quite a remarkable thing to happen, you know, for a lot of people. That might be quite the existential experience, but he's one of them like old school working class types who's just like, oh well, you've got to die sometime, so not bothered. Anyway, I'm gonna crack on before something else happens. So I do apologise, Scott. It's not usually this shoddy. Today's topic, we're talking about psychobiotics. That is how gut bacteria affects the brain. My guest today is Scott Anderson. Scott is a veteran science journalist with specialisation in medical research and computer programming. He's the author of a number of books covering topics as diverse as human embryonic stem cells and video production skills, and he was also one of the creators behind the computer game Lego Island, which was one of the biggest selling computer games of the 90s. He is a research consultant for Freedom Health, which is a laboratory which studies bacterial health in racehorses and has developed prebiotics for animals and humans. And his new book, The Psychobiotic Revolution, along with John Cryin and Ted Dinan from the APC Microbiome Institute, explores how and why your brain health and state of mind are intimately connected to your gut microbiome. In today's episode, we discuss the history of gut-brain research, how the gut and the brain communicate with one another, why the bacteria living in your digestive system may contribute to mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety, how Western dietary habits lead to the destruction of a healthy gut ecology, and we also discuss some of the pre- and probiotic foods that you can start consuming to bring your brain and body back into balance. Very alliterative. You can follow Scott on Twitter. He's at Psychobiotic. That's at Psychobiotic. As always, if you're enjoying this podcast, feel it's adding some value to your week, or just makes sitting on the toilet a little bit more exciting, please do consider supporting it. Just go to myownworstenemy.org/support, where you can donate or subscribe from as little as £1, and it's always massively, massively appreciated. And actually, I'll say, I started doing this thing as well recently where when you guys do donate, I want you to know that I appreciate it enough to send you a proper thank you email and not just have some, like some just copy and paste nonsense. So what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to come up with like funny anagrams for people's names so that when I send you a reply, you actually know it's me like sitting down and sending the reply and it's not just some automated email response. So, people with long names, especially welcome to donate. If your name's something like Zoe Lee, yeah, Zoe, forget it. You can listen for free. I can't do anything with something like that. So, yeah, that's that. Anyway, I think we've had environmental silence for about 2 minutes straight now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bail out now before it all starts going wrong again. So, as I always say, please enjoy my conversation with Scott Anderson. Okay, Scott Anderson, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. Okay, bit of an unusual one. So we are discussing the topic of psychobiotics. So basically how the gut microbiome, the bacteria in our stomach and intestines and what have you, how they affect our mood and mental health. However, before we get into all that, as I like to do with all my guests, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about you, your history, how this topic came of interest to you. Start from there.
Certainly. I'm basically a science writer, but I also have to make money on occasion. And so I work as a scientist, and I was called out to Ohio to work with racehorses. It turns out that racehorses in general, some 90% of them have ulcers. And the gastric ulceration was understood by most vets. But what they didn't understand, and what we were able to show, is that ulcers also occur in the colon of the horse. And that was kind of confusing. A lot of people didn't think we were correct on that, but we actually did the studies and showed that there is about 60% of the racehorses in the world have colonic ulcers as well. And so we studied that. We tried to figure out what was going on. And I had a supposition at the time that bacteria were involved. It was not a very popular theory, but when we tested it, we found out that indeed there was a change in bacteria when we looked at horses that had poor performance. And we found out doing some other tests that they actually were getting leaky guts, that their colons were leaking. And as a consequence, they were losing blood, and they had a sort of a low-level anemia. And we noticed that those horses were also not good performers, that they sort of had a bad attitude. They're called poor doers. And these poor doers actually seemed to be acting like they were depressed. And we don't want to get too carried away with what depression and anxiety means in an animal, but there is something there. And so I looked around to find what I could find in terms of bacteria and how they might affect the attitude of animals. And what I came across was shocking. I found the work of John Cryin and Ted Dinan, and they had said that there was something called a psychobiotic. And psychobiotics, they defined as something that could change the mood of an animal. In particular, they were looking at good biotics that improved the mood. And so it seemed to resonate with what I was doing. And so I got in touch with them. And that's when I sort of fell into the world of psychobiotics and realized that this was a perfect opportunity and a wonderful topic for a book. So that's sort of where that all comes from.
It's a relatively new field, though. Is that correct?
It is new. Probably it's almost all of it has been done in the 21st century. So in the last 10 years is where most of it is starting to happen, which is sometimes frightening for people. You don't want to jump into something too soon. And at the beginning, when we were looking at this, we had very good evidence that we could really help a depressed mouse. But beyond mice and rats, it was hard to know if we really had any good story there. So one of the conditions that I set up with John and Ted was that this book would be conditional on getting some good human studies. And they guaranteed me that was in the pipeline. And so we went ahead with the book, knowing that there were going to be human studies coming in by the time I got done with the book. So I had my fingers crossed. Unfortunately, those studies did come in. And we now know that probiotics or psychobiotics work as well in humans as they do in animals, or at least we're getting really good results in that direction.
Okay, so I guess maybe taking a step back a little bit, I'm wondering if you know the true sort of genesis of this idea of the relationship between the gut and the brain, whether we're going back to, I don't know, maybe the Victorian era or just anything, where this whole kind of thing evolved from, like the true genesis of it.
Well, you can go back to Hippocrates, who said that all illness starts in the stomach. He was looking at a lot of diseases and seeing that there was some sort of a connection. So at least vaguely, it was understood. But of course, Hippocrates didn't know anything about bacteria. And then when bacteria were finally visualized in the 1700s by Leeuwenhoek, who had built a beautiful microscope, they were considered to be curiosities. It was nothing that could really affect anything. It didn't seem like it was related to much. And there was a lot of skepticism about his work. And then we come up to Elie Metchnikoff, who is a Nobel Prize winner who had read about these people in Bulgaria who were eating yogurt. And they seemed to be in much better health, and they seemed to have a greater longevity. So he started working on that connection between what you eat and what your mental health is like. And then after a while, they started to recognize that there were bacteria, that the bacteria was what was making yogurt. And they found similar bacteria in sauerkraut, other fermented foods. And that leads up to the work of Louis Pasteur, who said, who we need to give a big call out because the French wine industry was dying. And he figured out that there was a bacterial explanation for what was going wrong. And he came up with solutions that allow us to have all the wines that we have today. So in a way, and there, of course, is a clear example of bacteria involved with mood, but not necessarily the way that we're talking about here. Then in 2004, a fellow named Sudo did this experiment, and it was really pretty simple. He had started raising mice in a germ-free environment. And these mice don't have any bacteria at all. They're very difficult to raise because without bacteria, bacteria turn out to be your best friends when it comes to protecting you. They're the first line of defense against the pathogens of the world. So your own gut microbiota is really important to your immunity. And he raised these mice in a germ-free environment, which is tricky, and you have to sterilize their food. All their bedding has to be sterilized. You have to get into there with, very specific little gloves and things that allow you to not infect them, because they'll die quickly if they get bacteria. Those mice that didn't have any bacteria behaved differently. They had anxiety levels and something that looked like mouse depression that were completely different from other mice. And when they gave them specific bacteria, a specific set of bacteria to kind of reintroduce them to the world, they improved, and their behavior changed really kind of shockingly. So that was the beginning where we started to understand, wait a minute, it's really the bacteria that are changing the behaviors of these mice. And that was the shock that set the whole thing off. And since then, a lot of the research has been done with germ-free mice. And that's how we know so much about anxious mice.
Right, okay. So I guess a good place to sort of, a good starting point to get into the thick of this might be, well, explaining really how the gut and the brain communicate in the first place, because it's not intuitive to sort of think of it like that, especially it being a two-way communication.
Right.
And then even less intuitive is the idea that the bacteria somehow, I don't know, influences or hijacks this communication. So if we could kind of give a layperson's basic explanation for, firstly, how the gut and the brain communicate in the first place, and then layer on top of that how the gut bacteria influences and affects that communication.
Sure. The interesting thing is that we have understood for a while that the gut has its own brain. It's a kind of like a tube sock of neurons that enclose the whole entire gut from the mouth down to the anus. And that has as many neurons in it as the spinal cord does. So it's an important neurological feature. It means that you can actually pull the gut right out of a person and it will still continue to pulse with peristalsis because it's under the control of its own local brain. So that's called by some people the second brain. And it communicates with your first brain in a lot of different ways. The primary one is through the vagus nerve, which runs straight from your gut up to the base of your brain. And that's a neurological communication between the two that is very, very important. We consider it to be probably the number one communication method between the gut and the brain. And it's a two-way street. It's mostly going from the gut up to the brain, but there is 10% of it or so that goes from the brain down to the gut as well. And that communication probably makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view, in the sense that if you eat something poor, if you eat something bad, there needs to be a way for your gut to tell your brain that this has happened and to, basically urge you to find a bathroom soon. And so there has to be a way of making this clear. And anxiety is one of those things that is the primary trigger. When you eat the wrong thing, all of a sudden you do feel really strongly that something is wrong. And it's important because pathogens are going to get into you from a lot of different avenues, but through your gut is probably the easiest way for them to get in, because your gut has this really fine-tuned situation. It needs to be able to let nutrients in so that you can get fed and get all the vitamins and energy that you need. But at the same time, it has to keep bacteria out. And that's where things get tricky. So you depend upon your good bacteria to keep the bad bacteria out. And what happens is if you have a breach, if, for instance, pathogens do make it past your gut barrier and into your bloodstream, then you will get inflammation. Inflammation is where you have all sorts of immune cells that start to gather around the area, and they can spread throughout your body. And that inflammation is also picked up by your brain. So this is another channel of communication, is when your brain suddenly senses that, oh my gosh, the immune system is telling me that we have an invasion. And if it's short term, your immune system will, in general, try to kill and destroy as many of the bad pathogens as it can, along with your own microbiota that also go to bat for you. And they will try and do the job, and generally they will succeed. But if it's not easy enough, or if it's not possible, or if you have a continuous injection of these bad pathogens, you may end up with chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation, we think, is behind a lot of cases of depression and anxiety. So it's this chronic aspect of it that makes it really dangerous. And the communication there is basically that we think something is wrong. We don't really know how to tell you exactly what it is, but your gut is telling you something is wrong. And if it lasts for a long enough period of time, it can become chronic depression.
Okay, well, one question sort of arises out of that for me is, when we're talking about this idea of a second brain in the digestive system, are we talking about literal brain cells that are the same in the digestive system as they are in the brain, with neurons firing? And
yeah, they are the same kinds of cells, got neurons, and they are neurons that can use most of the same kinds of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals that brain cells use to talk to each other. And a lot of people now know about these. The popular ones are like dopamine that make you feel good, serotonin that can help with depression and other kinds of mental issues. Those chemicals we have always thought were pretty special because they control our brain. And we love to exalt our brain. We think of ourselves pretty fondly in the pantheon of animals as being something like the pinnacle. And therefore, our brains must be using extremely convoluted and amazing chemicals to talk to each other. And that's not true. The bacteria in your gut can produce some of these same exact chemicals that your brain is using. And so there is a strange correlation between the communication that bacteria have with each other and the communication that our brain cells have with each other. So the organization of the gut brain is not the same as in the brain in your head. You don't have these highly complicated arrays of cells built up to analyze and to digest information. Oh, I shouldn't have said digest, but you don't really digest information in your brain, but you do digest food in your gut, and the kinds of cells are very similar. So the kinds of cells and the neurotransmitters they use are very similar between the gut brain and the brain in your head. And that's an alarming thing. That's something that we weren't prepared for when we started looking at this. We thought, well, there might be some interesting ways that they are talking to us, but certainly they're not talking to us with our own neurotransmitters. And that turns out to be a bad assumption. They are actually talking to us using neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters can talk to the gut brain as well as the brain in your head. We're not sure exactly how those neurotransmitters get through, but apparently they are.
So is this idea of this concept, is it a concept of a brain in the gut? Is it a way of conceptualizing it? Or has it been a literal discovery? And if so, how long have we known about this?
Well, the term second brain came from Michael Gershon, who studied this stuff in the 1900s, the late 1900s. He's still doing work. And it works in a kind of a similar way. What does the brain do? The brain looks at information that it gets from the environment, makes decisions about what to do, and then executes. And the gut is doing something similar. It's just that its environment is what's inside of you. And so it's looking at food that's coming in. It's looking at all sorts of signals that it's getting. It's looking at pathogens. It's looking at nutrients, and it's making decisions based on that. A lot of those decisions have to do with peristalsis. It has to do with serotonin, which turns out to be a neurotransmitter in our brain, but most of the serotonin in your body, some 90% of it, is actually in your gut. And in your gut, it helps to control peristalsis. And peristalsis is one of the first things that's going to happen rapidly if you take a pathogen. Your gut will say, okay, we have to get rid of these pathogens. We're going to flush everything out right now. And it starts to do its thing with peristalsis. And then it says, oh, by the way, brain, you better find a bathroom. So it's up to the brain to find the bathroom. The brain in your gut, on the other hand, is just saying, okay, push, and we're going to get this stuff out of here. And so it's a brain in the sense that it takes input and produces outputs. It's certainly not as complex as the brain in your head, but it has its own job, and it has plenty of neurons to do the job with.
Wow. Okay. Another thing that I don't know if this would be more of a speculative question, because it's such a new field of research. is, I think something that sort of stood out to me then was when you were saying that when these mice were sort of raised in this sterile environment and they've got no bacteria in the bodies at all, that they were more anxious, or they appeared to be at least more anxious. And did you say they're more depressed as well? Was it both? Was it the double whammy?
Yeah, they're seeing signs in some of these animals of kind of, it's hard. Depression is a little bit odd to try and talk about with a mouse, but what they're looking at is behavior and whether they're social or not. And these mice were not social,
Right.
not as social as normal mice, who are pretty gregarious and want to meet new friends and are very interested in new mice that come into their environment. These mice were not. And so in a sense, what you could say is that their microbes, the microbes that the mice have naturally, socialize them. And if they don't have them, then they don't ever really get socialized in the same way. It's almost as if the body knows that there's danger in the world and they need to kind of keep to themselves. It's hard to know exactly what's going on in the the mind of a mouse. But we have found that a lot of the things that we were worried about translating from mice to humans have turned out to translate fairly well. And one of the weirdest things about all of this is that you can take fecal matter from a human who is depressed or anxious and give it to a mouse, and they will become depressed and anxious. That means two things. It means, number one, that the mice are able to get the same kinds of results from bacteria as we do, which is comforting in the sense that we know now that a lot of the mice behavior does seem to apply to humans. But the other thing that's interesting about that is just that you can transfer the blues, you can transfer depression through fecal matter.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of framing this this question. Then is, I guess I'm wondering whether it's best to think of the way that bacteria in the gut affects the brain. Is it as best to be considered like a side effect, or is there a direct purposeful coexistence? And the reason I'm asking that is because, like you say, with the mouse without the bacteria is more anxious, and it's almost like, so the default state of the mouse without the bacteria is to be anxious, and then it's only with the introduction of it that it perks up, if you like. So I'm just wondering if it's best to, conceptualize it as the bacteria as a side effect, or as, purposeful coexistence.
Right. Well, in fact, what we have found is with germ-free mice is that it goes in more than one direction. We do know that there are behavioral differences. There are some conflicts, though. Some studies have shown that some mice that don't have bacteria seem to have more exploratory behavior, but less social behavior. So it's a little bit tricky to put your finger on it. What we do know is that once you give them bacteria, they start to act more social and they start to act more like your normal mice. We've also found that a lot of studies with mice we feel are a little trickier to analyze than we used to think, because you may have the same exact breed of mice as a mouse as somebody else does, but if you're feeding them differently, their behavior might be different, because they're going to be they'll have different gut bacteria. It's not clear, but it seems that after the millions of years of evolution, mammals have had gut bacteria for millions of years. And the arrangement that we made with the bacteria seems to be along the lines of, we'll provide you a nice warm place, and we will also feed you. And in return, the bacteria can get the most out of the nutrition that you eat. There are a lot of things that we eat that are not digestible by us, but are digestible by our bacteria. And that allows us to get more energy out of food that we would normally not be able to digest. So that's one thing they do. The other thing that they do is they produce certain vitamins that we need. And the most important thing I think that they do is they act as the first line of defense against the pathogens that are in the world that are constantly attacking us. We are as mammals, we are really slow to change our genetics. We don't evolve very quickly. But bacteria can evolve every time they multiply, and that's every 20 minutes. So they can run circles around us genetically. And that's why we've recruited our own set of microbes to fight the bad and rapidly changing microbes of the outside world. Whether they are talking to us in order to make us do things or not is not entirely clear, but we now know that several kinds of, we have a good feeling that our cravings for food are probably, or at least to some extent, those cravings are provided by microbes. And the story is that you would take a certain, let's say you've got a microbe like Streptococcus, which really likes sugar. Every time you eat sugar, because we now know that they can produce neurotransmitters, they can give you a shot of dopamine and make you feel good. So your cravings may not be anything that you've decided to sit down and say, I think I like donuts. It's rather your bacteria that are telling you, I like donuts, and you will give them to me. So it's possible that they are communicating with us in order to force us to give them what they want. And so to the extent that cravings are really associated with your bacteria more than your own personality is kind of shocking. But it shows that the microbes do have the ability, at least, to talk straight to you and say, here's what we want.
Wow, yeah, it's like almost like sort of the way that some parasites influence the host. It's it's quite scary, that. And just quickly before we get into the stuff to do with mood and mental health, I know some people are going to hear the idea of experimenting on mice, and like you've already said, the difficulties of sort of interpreting mood and stuff like that. I suppose one question would be for a lot of people, what is the justification for saying that, these experiments that have been conducted on mice, that the results are sort of transferable to humans as well?
Yeah, you have to be really careful when you're going from mice experiments. Mice are not the same as people, as we all know. It turns out that there are a lot more similarities, though, than we might have expected. And some of that showed up in these experiments when we were able to transfer fecal matter from humans to mice and see the same kind of thing happening to them, to see that our judgment, our prior judgment about what they were, quote unquote, feeling seems to match up pretty well to the feelings that the people had who were donating their fecal matter. So that's just an interesting hook, and it means that we can sort of trust what's going on there in broad strokes. But the real studies have just come out with humans, and they're showing very similar things. They're showing that people who take psychobiotics are improving their mood, and we are actually now able to see this happening in what's called fMRI, which is functional MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging. And it allows you to look at the brain and see which parts of your brain are lighting up. And they're able to see changes in people's brains after having eaten yogurt. So after a period of time eating yogurt, people have become self-reported in little quizzes that they give them. They self-report that they're feeling better, but then we can also see in their brains that their brains have changed. And so we're seeing that there's this physical change that's gone on in their heads that is giving us a good feeling about the overall ability of these mice experiments to transfer over to humans. But the human studies themselves are, of course, very expensive compared with mice, and you can't get germ-free people.
Yes.
That's something that we actually tried at one point. Doctors created or allowed a boy to be born who they strongly suspected would be without an immune system, and they raised him in a bubble. He was called the Bubble Boy. This is in the 1950s, I believe, and it did not work out well. He only lived to be about 13 or so, and he died when he was exposed to the world. And that kind of experiment is ridiculous. That's why we do things like that with mice instead of humans. But the transference has been pretty good. Now there are some things that are a little bit farther out there than others. They have something called a mouse model of autism spectrum disorder, and they look at these mice and they say, well, they're acting like they have autism. In other words, they have repetitive behaviors that they do, and they a few other things that they do that seem to mimic what some humans with autism do. I think it's still a little bit tricky to know how close those are, but even in those studies, which seem a little far out, we're seeing if you do what to people what we do to the mice, in other words, to change their microbes, that we do see a change in autistic behaviors. So we're now seeing this with some pretty good studies that are showing that if you take care of the gut microbes of people who are autistic, you can improve their behaviors. In particular, you can improve their antisocial behaviors. And so the idea is, well, perhaps their microbes are causing them anxiety, and that's a part of, decreasing their sociability and also leading them to be a little upset. So these kinds of studies that we're seeing now are still preliminary, but they're very heartening. To think that we could help with something like autism by manipulating the microbes in your gut is wonderful, because there's currently nothing else we can do.
Yeah, okay. So, right, so we've kind of did a brief little summary, I guess, before of how the gut bacteria influences something like depression. But I'd like to go into a bit more detail about that now. And I suppose the two mental health conditions of most interest are depression and anxiety, because they're the most common as well. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of take us through how each one of those might be caused by the gut bacteria, and also whether there's kind of any interesting correlations between the prevalence of a certain type of gut bacteria and specific mental health issues, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. That's what we've been looking at. Is we now can point to several bacteria that are known to cause anxiety, and these are bacteria that produce vast quantities of certain kinds of fatty acids and also some kinds of neurotransmitters that can put people into an anxious state. And these are the way that you can deal with that is to try and get rid of them through antibiotics. But antibiotics are a really broad brush, and they can kill the good guys as well as the bad guys. And that's why we've sort of concentrated on psychobiotics, which are the good bacteria that include things like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Those are two of the primary ones that people are looking at in terms of psychobiotic activity. And what they do is that they will fight against these anxiety-producing bacteria. So that is kind of an interesting way to deal with it, is to say, okay, we see that some of these bacteria are producing these chemicals that can cause anxiety. You can put, there's something that's on the cell surface of a bacteria, certain kinds of bacteria, called lipopolysaccharide, which we'll just call LPS. And LPS, in even small amounts, if you inject it into somebody, they will instantly cause them to become anxious, because the body is tuned by millions of years of evolution to know that you have a bad guy, a pathogen in your system. And that causes instant anxiety. And if that happens for a long period of time, if you are chronically inflamed, then that can also lead to depression. And depression is kind of like, you can compare it to something called sickness behavior. Sickness behavior is when you have the flu or something, and you basically say, look, I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to cover myself up. Leave me alone. Unless you're going to bring me some hot soup, leave me alone. And so the idea is that is not very different from some kinds of depressive behavior, where you feel basically like, I am not happy, I'm not sad, I'm just want to be left alone. I don't want to do anything. I have no energy. I don't really feel motivated. And that kind of sickness behavior kind of fades in to depression. And at least to certain kinds of depression, we think that we can see a connection there. And where we saw this first was in a place called Walkerton in Canada, where they had a flood that caused bacteria from the local farms to get into their water system. And one of the bacteria was Campylobacter. And Campylobacter jejuni is a known bad actor. And these people got very sick. The entire town of 5,000 people all got sick. And years later, there were still repercussions from this. People had IBS. People developed IBS from this infection. And some large percentage, say 80% of those with IBS, also came down with depression. And that depression lasted for years after the initial infection. So there was a case where we could see, a pretty large scale case, where we could see, given that you've been infected with Campylobacter, you could then become affected by irritable bowel syndrome, other kinds of gastric disorders, and then also become depressed and anxious. So that was a really good connection for us to see what the genesis could be. And that we're not saying that all depression is caused by getting food sickness or food poisoning, but at least we know some kinds are. And that's a good way to see how the bacteria have gone on to pass the gut to get into the rest of the body and then to influence your brain.
Yeah, I'm guessing one question that's sort of arisen for me there is this, like you were just talking about, say, food poisoning then, as influencing whether someone's going to come down with, say, depression or anxiety. And I suppose from a very reductive kind of perspective, well, I'm wondering how much diet has to do with this. That the foods that we're eating are the things that are is the thing that's influencing the ecology, the makeup of the gut bacteria, and whether that's, you mentioned the word genesis, then the genesis of these things, and whether that's a fair assumption to make that our diet has got a massive amount to do with the prevalence of mental health issues like depression and anxiety.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw from the Walkerton debacle was that some people recovered a lot faster than others. And those were the ones that were eating a diet that was better for their gut bacteria. So they were enhancing in their guts the populations of Bifidobacter and Lactobacillus and a few others that we now know of, to the extent that they were able to fight off the Campylobacter. The ones with the weaker system, the ones with the weaker microbiota, couldn't overcome the Campylobacter. And this was a bad case too, because as I mentioned before, either you can't deal with it and they take over, or you just are continuously exposed to it. But for some reason, if you're exposed to it for a long time, if it becomes chronic, then depression kind of sets in. And in the case of Walkerton, they did not know where, for a while, the city didn't tell them that the problem was their water. So a lot of these people continued to drink the water. And so even some that were pretty well positioned to fight off the Campylobacter, it was dose after dose after dose that they were getting. And so it's one of those cases where, yes, you can protect yourself. If your diet is something like the Mediterranean diet, there's actually quite a lot of really good diets that are out there. And nobody knows exactly why they're good diets. Our theory is that they're good diets because they're feeding the good bacteria. And that's done by feeding them fiber. And we actually consider fiber to be psychobiotic as well as microbes. So any fiber that's feeding your psychobiotic bacteria is also psychobiotic and has the capability of improving your mood because it improves your bacterial composition. So that's one of the things that diet can do is to, feed your good bacteria so you just feel good in general. And the other one is to make sure that you've got a tough army ready to fight the pathogens when they do attack you. And so those are two good reasons to keep a good gut. And we don't really think too much about it, but those gut bacteria that you have are the first line of defense that you have against the wild world out there.
how would you guys sort of account for so obviously there's a cognitive model of things like anxiety and depression, and it's almost like different schools of thought are trying to make the discovery of what causes these things. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what would be the relationship between this idea of gut microbiota affecting depression and anxiety, and sort of linking it up with a cognitive model as well, because I suppose they almost seem to be at odds with one another to a certain extent.
Well, I don't think they are at odds, and there's nothing about psychobiotics that says that that regular meds for depression are not recommended. We are absolutely not saying anything like that. We think that the medicines the current medicines that we have for treating depression are remarkable, and so we're not trying to replace one with the other. The traditional idea of what goes on in the brain is that it's a neurotransmitter problem. And the idea is, and that's why we try to give things that affect neurotransmitters. The serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The reason we don't give serotonin, by the way, is because the serotonin will get swamped by all the serotonin in your gut. And there is a blood-brain barrier against serotonin. So it's not supposed to be able to easily get into your brain from your gut. So we give these reuptake inhibitors. They do get into your brain, and they stop the degradation of serotonin in your brain, thus leaving more of it around for keeping your brain stimulated. And those things are the way that all that started was actually fascinating. Some of the first antidepressants that were discovered were actually trying to treat tuberculosis. So they were using chemicals that they thought would help alter the bacteria, would basically treating some of these first chemicals as antibiotics that would kill the tuberculosis bacteria. So what happened is that these people got these drugs and all of a sudden seemed to become happy. They had been sitting in lawn chairs trying to soak up some sun, and then all of a sudden the next day they were like dancing and having a good time, and people were shocked. It was like, this is not what we expected at all. And yet, when you think about it, these are monocycline derivatives, and these things were practically miraculous. But if you keep it in perspective, these were attempts to deal with microbes, not attempts to deal with the mood. And yet we've seen from the very beginning with all of the drugs that we've used is that there is this crossover, and that when you realize 95% of the serotonin in your body is in your gut, you realize that there is something going on that is related to your brain in a way that is not exactly clear. And the studies about how the mind is helped by psychoactive drugs, a lot of them have to do with trying to top off certain neurotransmitters. So some of them are trying to get you to increase your dopamine. Some are trying to get you to increase your serotonin. Some try to get you to increase GABA, which is another neurotransmitter. And so these are things that have been going on for a long time. It's not clear that you can just top off something in your brain. The brain is exquisitely complex. And so it's not clear that you can just add a chemical and that'll make everything go away. And the newer psychoactive drugs actually attempt to do more than one neurotransmitter at a time. And those are having some better response too. The theory behind psychobiotics is that a lot of these drugs can be delivered by the bacteria through your gut. And we don't know exactly how that's getting through, but there seems to be something either through the vagus nerve or through interactions with hormones and the immune system that is letting that happen. And I don't see psychobiotics as being contra normal psychoactives at all. In fact, they are 100% compatible, and we would think of psychobiotic therapies more adjunctive to what you're doing. The downside of some of the psychoactive drugs out there is that some of them make you fat. And they do it quickly. And so that would be one of those things that we would be trying to help with with a sort of a better, more moderated approach.
Yeah, I guess, well, one of my questions was actually whether, do we know whether these different treatments, different types of drugs, have any effect themselves on the gut microbiome?
Yeah, and we're finding that they do. And that is probably, we're not clear about how all these things interact down there, but the idea that a serotonin reuptake inhibitor is going to go straight to your brain, well, we know that some of that's going to go and stay in your gut. That may be a part of why there's weight gain involved with some of these drugs. But there is definitely going to be a connection, and that connection is going to be partly also due to the two-way transmission of the vagus nerve. Your gut talks to your brain a lot through the vagus nerve, but your brain can talk to your gut as well. And it can tell it to settle down. It can tell it to go into high alert. It can do a lot of things. For instance, if you're being chased by a lion, your brain will tell your gut to stop, shut down. It will not only tell your gut to stop, it'll tell your immune system to stop. If you've got a flu or something like that, your brain doesn't care. You're being chased by a lion. First things first, and we'll deal with the flu later. So your immune system shuts down under situations of stress. And if you're living in the savannah and a tiger or a lion is chasing you, that's fine. It's all going to be over with in a few minutes. You will either have run away from the lion or you will be lunch. But it doesn't go on for a long time. In modern environments, however, we tend to get stressed and have the stress last for a long, long time. And so that can affect your gut as well. That kind of stress can actually affect what goes on in your gut, which then in turn can increase your stress. So you get into a vicious cycle. It's hard to get out of it.
Yeah, it's also kind of made me think of the relationship between maybe cause and effect, because if we become depressed first, then that's making us eat bad, and then that's affecting the gut ecology. Or has the gut ecology become messed up, which has then made us depressed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And causality is one of those things that's actually, it's a holy grail for scientists, but it's also very, very hard to show. Most of the studies that we see are showing associations, correlations, not necessarily causation. And you're right, in a situation like this where one thing can feed back into another thing, it's very, very difficult to prove absolute correlation or absolute causation. And so we are left a lot with just these correlations that we say. And the big thing that all scientists say is correlation is not causation. And we have to remember that all the time.
How, just from the sort of the primitive amount of research or whatever that's done on this, because it's such a new topic, how optimistic are you that this psychobiotics might be the holy grail, if you like, of figuring out mental illness?
Well, it's very compelling. To me, the most compelling things are that we can transfer fecal matter from one animal to another and transfer depression and anxiety with it. That is as close to causality as we're going to get for a while, because it shows that the fecal matter is sufficient to cause depression. Now, there are a few other things that need to be done to really show causality, but that's a really compelling case that says, yep, there's something going on with those bacteria and they are in charge of your mood.
Okay, Scott, let me just hold this thought a minute and go into this a little bit more. So for assuming no prior knowledge, can you just briefly explain the idea of fecal matter transplants? Yes.
This is something that has a long history as well. There's something in China called yellow soup, and it's as bad as it sounds. And there was something that they would make out of the fecal matter from somebody healthy, and then they would give it to somebody who was sick, and they would drink it. And that is not a pleasant thought, but it seemed to have worked. And is as unpleasant as it was, people would take it if there was no other solution. So today we've got it a little bit better. We can fix the whole thing up to be a little bit cleaner, a little bit. What we do is we give somebody antibiotics to clean out their current existing microbiota. And then we give them a suppository that has fecal matter from somebody else who has been checked out. And now we used to check just to make sure that they were healthy, that they didn't have viruses, they didn't have pathogens. But now we're also checking to see if they're depressed or obese or several other things that we now know can be transmitted when we transmit fecal matter. And so the idea is that that'll go up through a suppository, and that will replace your fecal matter. And it's actually so simple to do that there are instructions on the internet for how to do it, and I would not recommend doing that. It is something that if you think about your gut and your microbiota and the amazing complexity of it, it's like an organ in your body. And to do a DIY, to do your own fecal transplant is kind of like, oh, let's just see if we can do an organ transplant in the kitchen. I recommend against that. I recommend to your readers that they go and find somebody who knows what they're doing. And so that's how it works. Where it became really popular was we have a lot of people dying in the hospital from Clostridia difficile. And it's called C. diff by a lot of people. And C. diff infections are nasty. And what's happened as they have given these patients so many antibiotics to kill everything, the last one standing is C. diff. It can form spores and they can survive a lot of antibiotic treatments. So that turned out to be something that people were dying from. And when they were offered to have this fecal transplant, they didn't even say, ugh, they just said, bring it on, because they were dying. And it turns out that statistics are a little sketchy, but it looks like 90% or over 90% of people who get fecal transplants can cure their C. diff infections. And that's an astonishing success rate for something like that. The FDA in the United States has said, well, we think that a fecal transplant is like a drug, which is a remarkable thing to say about a fecal sample. But that's their opinion. And as a consequence, they've kind of clamped down on it. We're not doing as much of it as we were doing. So that's kind of an interesting thing.
It seems such a bizarre concept that you can basically, well, just swap a turd between two people effectively,
right.
and it changes their psychological makeup and cheers them up. And I'm just kind of struggling to wrap my head around that at all.
Yes, that it's really hard to believe that we could be that well defined by our microbes. There are a lot of things that we have as humans that we consider to be our personalities that are not necessarily ours, and it's a humbling thing. There's no doubt about it. Our cravings are actually controlled by our bacteria. That's astonishing. And we don't know that all of them are, but we know that at least some of them are. Our depression, our mood, all of these things are kind of nutty to think that they are associated with our bacteria. But again, it's an association. We know that in some cases it's very good, but we also know of lots of kinds of depression and anxiety that are probably not going to be amenable to a psychobiotic approach. But we are still, the deeper we dig, the more we find bacteria. So some of the latest is finding out that bacteria seem to be associated with Alzheimer's, and perhaps Parkinson's and other mental issues. We're finding that bacteria, although they're not supposed to get into your brain, bacteria seem to get into your brain. And it's just we have leakiness. And when that happens, your brain uses glial cells to go after microglial cells that go after the bacteria. But like a fireman with an axe, you'll get the fire put out, but sometimes you will bring the building down. Mm. And so that's kind of an issue that we're looking at now in terms of just how much of our life is controlled by these microbes. And it's turning out to be more and more. The deeper we look, the more we find. And that's not to be unexpected, really, because we have this new tool. We've got this new tool called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which allows us to look at the bacteria in a way we never could. And this just started happening in the last 20 years or so. And previous to that, we had to culture bacteria. And it turns out most bacteria do not culture very well. So we didn't even know they existed until we saw PCR. Once we saw PCR, once we had PCR in our hands, we were able to look everywhere, and we saw everywhere we looked, we saw bacteria. We weren't expecting to see them in any of these places. We didn't expect to see any bacteria in the brain, didn't expect to see it in the pancreas, we didn't expect to see it in a lot of these places that we are now finding bacteria and finding out that they have a lot to do with a lot of diseases that we didn't think previously had anything to do with the microbiome.
Mm. Right, okay. So sort of moving into the final third of this now and concentrating on the dietary aspect of it. My first question is whether, at this point, do we know whether there's any interesting correlations between, say, the prevalence of certain mental health issues and, say, dietary habits in different countries, say East versus West, or maybe historical diets versus the modern diet, things like that?
Well, the problems that we're having in society today, in particular, the World Health Organization says now that depression is the number one cause of disability in the world. There are 350 million people with depression out there. And it's happened recently. It's happened over the last 50 years or so. And so there might be some genetic aspects to it, but human genes don't change that fast. So it's down to something else in the environment. And when we look around and look at different diets, the one that seems to be associated with the depression is the Western diet, the one that the United States in particular has exported so efficiently to the entire world. And it's very heavy in sugars and very low in fat, because that's what we decided a long time ago in the 1970s, that was the right way to go. And it turned out that was a mistake. But we're happily sending it around the world anyway. The diets that come from different countries like Japan, Japan has had thousands of years of civilization to try and figure out what's going to work for them. They have a diet that includes things like seaweed and lots of pickled fermented foods. And then there's the diet of the Mediterranean style diet, which also has thousands of years of history behind it, and also uses a lot of fermented foods and a lot of fiber. There's a Nordic diet, again, a country that Norway that has had many centuries to figure out a good diet. And then you get the United States, where we are just a mishmash of all sorts of bad dietary things. We don't have the history to have come up with something that makes sense. We don't know how to put foods together to have the proper nutrients. We are the kind of the new kids on the block, and we have made a mess of it. And unfortunately, we're really good at exporting it. And so what we're seeing is that a diet that's high in sugar supports the wrong kinds of bacteria. And a diet that's high in fiber supports the right kinds of bacteria. So what you want to do dietarily is to minimize the carbs as much as possible and maximize the fiber. And then from there, a lot of it is up in the air. There are many different ways to look at it. I would not declare a single diet to be the winner, although the Mediterranean diet has a lot of adherents, and I think that is a good thing, and I would totally recommend anybody who wanted to do that. Fish oil in particular has an interesting impact on your microbiome. It turns out to be anti-inflammatory. And again, what we're saying is a lot of depression seems to be associated with inflammation. And if that's the case, how do you minimize inflammation? And one way to do it is to get a better microbiota, because inflammation is going to be caused by infection. So it's going to be caused by pathogens. And if you want to get rid of your pathogens, you need to keep your good microbiota in top shape so that they can fight off the bad guys.
So what would be, so there's this, we probably should have covered this a bit earlier on actually, but so there's prebiotics and probiotics. I think most people would be familiar with probiotics and less so with prebiotics. But could you just explain exactly what they are? Because they're the two foundation stones, I suppose, of psychobiotics.
Yeah, they are. Well, probiotics, as people know, are the good bacteria that are in yogurts, and it turns out there are a lot of other things that people don't realize have probiotics in them, namely pickles and kraut and anything that's fermented has bacteria in it. And then what we do, especially in the United States, is then we pasteurize it and kill all the good guys. So again, not a smart move. But we're not exporting brilliance here, but we're making lots of money by exporting all these bad foods. So that's a probiotic. A prebiotic is basically fiber, and people think of fiber as like tree bark or something, but fiber is really just complex sugars that we cannot break down in our gut. Those complex sugars make it all the way to the colon, and that's where we have about 3 pounds of bacteria that just say, yippee, it's dinner time. If you don't eat fiber, you will be starving those bacteria, and you will end up with a far less diverse microbiota. And diversity is key to health in this situation. The less diverse your gut is, the less healthy you will be in general, and that includes mental health. And then, so we've got prebiotics and probiotics, both of which can be psychobiotics. And psychobiotics are just a subset of those that support the growth of beneficial species like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria.
What would be recommended as sort of a minimum effective dose, a daily menu of foods, or a little menu of pre and probiotics that everybody should be trying to consume daily?
Sure. If you look at some of the people, the Hadza of Africa, they're getting like 50 grams or so of fiber a day, and we should probably be getting something like that too, but we usually get less than 10. Fiber has actually been taken out of our foods, and that was done in order to make them refined and delicious. And so you get all sorts of white breads and white cakes and all that stuff, and the fiber was probably the best part of the food, and it's the first thing that we take out. So the Western diet is dangerously low in fiber. And it's ridiculous. We've done it to ourselves. So you can supplement that with various fibers that are available right out on the market that you can get. And we actually kind of recommend those over probiotics because these prebiotics are less likely to be tainted in a sense. We're not positive, but we're kind of favoring prebiotics. And that includes things that are called oligosaccharides. These are complex sugars. And they include things like fructo-oligosaccharide and galacto-oligosaccharide. These things are known by FOS and GOS, F-O-S and G-O-S. You can buy them online if you need them, and they are just a powder that you can put into your coffee, and that's a good start. But there are plenty of foods that are full of fiber, and those include foods like artichokes, asparagus, onions. So we definitely want people to be looking at the right kinds of vegetables to be eating that are high in fiber. That's one of the things that you can do in order to get your prebiotics. And then your probiotics, what we're looking at is instead of pills, although the pills may be helpful, but we're not real thrilled with the self-policing of people who are making prebiotics or probiotics. In the United States, anybody can make a probiotic, and you don't have to have it approved by the FDA or anything. So anything goes. It's the Wild West. But there are probiotics in food that have been around for centuries. Those we feel a little bit better about, and that's including sauerkraut and pickles and things like that. So, but you have to get them natural. You have to get them unpasteurized, or you miss the benefit. And that's a shame because a lot of, especially in the United States, we pasteurize virtually everything. And we even pasteurize our yogurt and then re-add bacteria after that. So we're kind of nutty about all this.
Yeah, I think on your blog you recommend Greek yogurt as well. And I think that's going to be the easiest sell for people is Greek yogurt. Pickles and sauerkraut, I know that might be a difficult sell for some. So again, what's a decent amount, again, a minimum effective dose of yogurt?
Well, we think that what we've seen in the studies that have shown a result is a reasonable serving, a cup or so of yogurt, maybe twice a day. The Greek yogurt we recommend, and we don't recommend low fat, because low fat, when you take the fat out, what's left is a higher range of sugar. And so you're basically, low fat is almost the same as high sugar, and we are not recommending that. The fats, it turns out, are not as bad for us as we thought. So go for a full fat Greek yogurt that doesn't have sugary fruit in it. So you can add fruit if you want, but just add fruit. Don't add sugar. Don't add honey. Don't add syrup or anything like that. So that's another point to keep in mind, is that what we're looking at here is something that has the ability to be terrible. If you just get fruit-filled yogurt that's low fat, you've got basically a sugar bomb, and that's not going to, no amount of bacteria is going to be able to help you from that. So a normal kind of a serving, some people, like the Bulgarians, will eat quite a bit. They'll eat several cups a day because it's a part of every meal with them. They have been assumed to be pretty healthy, and I don't have any evidence against that. But the other things that are happening, we're starting to see here in our little place in Ohio, the store is starting to stock actual live culture sauerkraut and pickles, and they are actually delicious. You would be surprised. I know people are not necessarily tuned into kraut, but they used to be. It was refrigeration that came and knocked kraut out of business. Kraut and pickled foods have been a part of humanity forever, because that was our answer to not having refrigerators. So refrigerators are actually responsible for kicking out an awful lot of good probiotic foods. Not that there's bad with refrigerators, but just to give you some historical perspective on why we have lost our taste for kraut.
Well, what I'm going to be doing is, again, read your blog, and I think this is back in about 2014, I think it was, maybe when you were first toying with the idea of doing the book. And because I think you did a 30-day experiment with yogurt, and then you said you felt better off it. So I'm going to do the same thing. And since I booked this interview with you, I've been having yogurt every day, about a cup a day of natural Greek full fat yogurt. So I've got about 20 something days to go. And I will be reporting back on that in the intro to this. And also the other thing is, I didn't realize how easy it is to make sauerkraut. I'll let you explain. It's so simple. Even a idiot like me can manage this. So.
Yeah, sauerkraut, I ask people, do you know how to make kraut? They say, well, you have to add vinegar or something? I said, no, the recipe for kraut is cabbage. That's basically it. Now, what we do to make kraut around here is we slice it thin, slice the cabbage up, and then we add a little salt. And the salt is basically to break down the cell walls to let some juices out. And then the juices come out and cover up the kraut itself, cover up the cabbage. All that a fermentation is the main thing is that it's anaerobic, meaning that oxygen doesn't get to it. So if there are parts of your kraut that are sticking up from the liquid, they can get moldy, they can get other kinds of bacteria. But everything that's under the water will become fermented with beneficial bacteria. So those are the good guys. The salt may help to keep away some of the bad guys, but the basic recipe is cabbage and salt, and you can probably get by without the salt at all if you are able to keep everything submerged at all times. So it's very simple. If you go 10 days like that, you can taste it. It should start tasting like kraut, and if you like it at that stage, start eating it. You can also let it sit around for a lot longer. It'll get more sour with time. And you can drink the juice as well. It actually makes a wonderful tonic. So that can be done with cabbage. That's your sauerkraut. But across the world, people have all sorts of ways of making fermented foods. The Poles make something called kvass, where they take beets and basically do the same thing, put a little salt on it, keep it under the water, and they get something that is this beautiful blood red fermented drink called kvass, and I think it's delicious. Some people I've seen their faces as they drink it. And whoa! It's kind of sour, it's kind of salty, but I think it's delicious. So this is something where your mileage may vary, But if you give it a couple of tries, I've seen most people have come around to it and said, "Wow, all right, I'll take that."
Yeah, no, I'm definitely going to try it. I do actually like sauerkraut. I've tried it before, and I bought it a while ago with this idea of it being like a probiotic. But again, I didn't realise that it had been pasteurised, so there was nothing in it. It's just cabbage and a bit of vinegar or whatever. So yeah, I'm definitely going to give that a go. So, couple of closing questions then. So, okay, a quote from your blog is, keep in mind that your particular bacterial zoo gets well established early in life and it's difficult to dislodge. And so I'm wondering whether, say, you're feeling sluggish, you're not feeling too great, and you've tried this, that, and the other, and you think that maybe changing your diet and trying to cultivate a good gut ecology might be the way forward. When you start to consume fermented foods and pre and probiotics, is this something you have to do it for life then? Or can you sort of get the right amount of bacteria in the gut and then they'll do the rest of the work? And you can sort of quit after 30 days maybe?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Danny. I don't think anybody knows exactly what the answer to that is,
Okay.
but your gut bacteria, your microbiota, is pretty resistant to change. If you were lucky enough to be breastfed and to get a perfect upbringing, by the time you were about 2 years old, you have a wonderful microbiota. If you were C-section, or if you didn't get breastfed, or if you had antibiotic treatments when you were younger, your gut microbiota may not be as nice as it could be, and you may suffer for the rest of your life for that. And so that's something that it makes it tricky. We've seen that fecal transplants last for at least 8 weeks, maybe a couple of years in some cases. And that's not to say that it changes after that. It's just to say that we've taken it out that far. And we still see that the fecal transplant has stayed with that person. It hasn't reverted back to form. I guess the idea is that it's not just one species. It's a whole group of species that work together, and it forms a very cohesive neighborhood, and it's hard to change. You can add a few. If you look at what's in a normal probiotic pill, it's got like 50 billion bacteria, and you say, wow, that's a lot, but you have 100 trillion in your gut, so it's a drop in the bucket. It's less than 1,000th of what's already in your gut. So it's hard to know how you're going to change it that well, and we have not seen very good results. I think that we are going to end up having to take these kinds of foods forever. Now, if it's something like a Mediterranean diet, well, there's millions of people who just live that way and don't have any problems. So that doesn't seem like it's such a bad duty. But I can tell you, I know people here. You can tell them how bad sugar is, and you can tell them how their diet is killing them, and there's no fiber in it, and they'll just say, "I have gotten used to this. This is the way I like it." That may be partly their gut telling them that, but it's something that's hard for people to change. Nevertheless, if you can do it, if you can bring yourself to change, then you should make a lifetime commitment to it. That means find foods that you really do like and that you're not going to just use for a while and then say, "Oh God, I'm glad I'm done with that."
Okay, so interestingly, one sort of accusation that I've read that sort of, if it's true, it'd blow this whole thing out the water from a dietary aspect anyway. Particularly an accusation leveled at these like probiotic drinks is that there's no point in taking them because the bacteria can't get past the stomach acid in the first place. By the time any of the probiotic actually reaches the digestive tract, all the bacteria has been killed off by the stomach acids. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if that's also the case for, when you're eating fermented foods, how much of the bacteria is actually making its way to the important part of the digestive system.
Right. We used to think that the acids in the stomach were to help with digesting food, but now we actually think that it's there, at least in part, to kill pathogens. So you're right. A lot of them are going to get killed right off the bat. And but some estimates are that 20 to 30% make it through. So it's not like it's nothing getting through. It's not like that. It's that a lot less is going to get through than what we hope. When you eat something like sauerkraut or yogurt, you're not just eating a prebiotic, but you're eating a probiotic with it. So it's got both. And that can maybe help buffer it, get through the stomach, and to provide a background and some food for those probiotics as they move through your system. But if you think about it, yogurt, which does make it to your gut and will form a part of it, yogurt is milk, and it's bacteria that's growing in milk that it likes, and that's not, your gut is not its natural environment. So a lot of these probiotics, they will have a good effect, but it's only going to be while they're on their way through. So they may be providing good nutrients, they may be providing good fiber, but it's transient. They're on their way through, and they're not very many of them are going to take up a living in your gut. Very few of them are going to be what they call persisters. So that's one of the reasons why you may have to eat yogurt for the rest of your life, is because they're not really going to settle in that much. So it's possible that we'll be able to come up with some better answers with better species of bacteria that will address the issue much better, and that will take up a living in your gut, and that will be provided to you with sort of an acid resistant capsule, so that it can make it past all the bad guys and get down to your colon, where it really wants to do the most work. So that's possible. The probiotics that we have are available not because they're what we want, but because they're easy to manufacture. So as you might imagine, this is not necessarily the best possible solution. This is why we don't necessarily promote probiotics as much as we do foods that contain them. But those probiotics are not necessarily things that are going to be psychobiotic in action. And the ones that we're finding that are psychobiotic are hard to manufacture. So we still have a learning curve to go through when it comes to strictly eating microbes. There's a lot, like you say, starting with the gut, starting with the acids in the stomach. It's got to run through a gauntlet of damage before it can get to where it can do some good.
Yeah, the last one I saw, and again, I mean, because the literature is kind of sparse on this at the moment, especially the layperson literature. This might be just bro science that I've read, but another accusation I read about it was that not an accusation, but that might be a problem for a lot of people is I read somewhere someone saying that it's all well and good taking in these probiotics, and even if you get a decent gut ecology on the go, if at the same time you're consuming artificial sweeteners, that they can have a negative effect and pretty much destroy a lot of the gut bacteria as well. And I was just wondering if there's any truth in that, because it's one of those things where, someone might go into this super enthusiastic, like, right, I'm on the sauerkraut and the yogurt and stuff, but then inadvertently they're still consuming artificial sweeteners that might be offsetting the effect. So,
right, it's not just artificial sweeteners; it's also emulsifiers, which we're now finding out have a hugely negative effect on the gut microbiota. And these are unanticipated. We're just now learning about some of these things. The story about emulsifiers is, to me, even more damning than the story about artificial sugar. But you're right; those are not helping you. Right. It all stemmed from a good idea. Everybody had the right intention in mind, but it doesn't seem that these artificial sweeteners are doing the job of keeping the pounds off, number one. And number two, it does seem that they are negatively infecting our gut microbes. So those are things that honestly, I see that as being one of the hardest things of all for people to deal with, because we never, historically, evolutionarily, we never were presented with donuts, and there were very few croissants rolling across the savannah when, to our ancestors living in the in the jungle and stuff, fast food back then was a gazelle because it was fast.
Yeah.
And you had to run for it. So today what we've got is this something that has transformed our palate. And we are very, very loath to give up our sugar. And I am shocked at how many people can't do it. It's not that hard to do. And here's the upside is that although you may have to continue to feed your gut with the right stuff in order to keep it in top form, there are some things that get better within weeks of doing it. In other words, if you stop eating sugar for only about 2 weeks, your gut, you will have killed off enough of the bad bacteria that are craving sugar that you won't notice it anymore. So it only takes a few weeks for your taste buds to actually change, because you can change the gut bacteria enough to mute the clamor of certain pathogens for sugars. So it's not perfect, and those guys can hang around. By the way, nothing ever goes away in your gut. It seems they hang around in little crevices, and they can come back as soon as you relapse. All of a sudden, you got that first donut, and you're on a jag to eat everything with sugar in it. But if you can just with a little self-control for the first couple of weeks, after that it gets a lot easier. And I can tell you that my personal experience is that I don't eat sugar at all anymore in any form. And I'm a guy who used to eat it everywhere. I didn't see any reason why you couldn't put sugar in spaghetti. So, so it's doable.
Yeah, I've got to say this, that the Western diet, it's just the evidence against it is just piling up. It's so ridiculous. I can't help but imagine that in 100 years' time, it's going to be one of them, like when we used to burn witches and stuff. People are going to look back on it and think, what the hell were you lot playing at, eating like that?
It's a scandal. It's a scandal. It's not something that was motivated by nutrition at all. Everything that is being done in the Western diet is strictly about taste and about selling people on food that tastes good. Nobody cares about the nutritional quantities that are in there. We take out, now part of it is, a lot of it is sensible from a manufacturing point of view. We take out the fiber because the fiber and the fats in, say, flour give it a shorter lifespan, especially the fats. The fats can go rancid, so we take the fats out. We take the fiber out so that it can be nice and pure and white and give you this really smooth textured cake. But these things are not nutritional. And then we fortify them, but what we put back into them in terms of nutrients is, number one, not all the nutrients we took out, and number two, not the same quantities. There may be a third as much nutrition that we put back in as what we take out. So merely the refinement of food is the number one reason why so many things have gone wrong in the world in the last 50 years. I mean, there are other issues. None of this stuff is black and white. Antibiotics play a role because we're obviously killing many bacteria with that. And if you've had a lot of antibiotic treatments in your youth, you're going to have problems with your gut, maybe forever. So there are a lot of things, but the Western diet, I think, is the biggest culprit in all of this. And it's done so that you can grow 1,000,000 miles worth of corn. And then out of that, you can get sugar from one spigot, and you can get flour from another spigot, and then you can move those together to make anything you want. So it's very simple. You can just make, you don't grow food anymore, you manufacture it.
Yeah, it's tricky as well. I mean, especially from this idea of it being, particularly from a mental health perspective, it's, I think there's no doubt that for a lot of people, it is the diet and the nutritional aspect, and especially now this bacterial aspect that's causing a lot of these mental health problems. But the shitty irony of it is that it's them same foods that help people feel better about themselves and that help them get through these periods as well. So
it's insidious.
It is insidious. God.
But trust me, you can get over those bad cravings and you can get into a new set of cravings and you'll just feel like a new person. It can actually do a great amount of good. It's interesting that in mental hospitals that there's a huge craving for sugar in those places, and it's hard to deal with. It seems that it's related somehow to the health of the people, but like you say, there's a real strong need that people feel it's their comfort food. But within a few weeks or so of changing your diet, your new comfort food could actually become an artichoke.
Yeah, you're going to struggle with that slogan, Scott, honestly. Okay, so right, to close this up, I guess a good question would be, and it's very broad as well, but what do you think is the future of psychobiotics, and whether that's just purely from a research perspective, or the potential that they've got to change the world? Just very broadly, what do you think the picture looks like going forwards?
Well, I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but there are specific bacteria that we know are much better for us than the ones that most people have. In particular, that those of us on the Western diet have. So one of the things that I can see for the future of psychobiotics is that we'll have a way to manufacture some of these and specific ones that we know are good, and then find a way to actually get them into us without needing a suppository or something. And so that would be one thing that I would look forward to is something that really addresses the issue better than what we've got out there now. Something that it transcends yogurt by a factor of 1,000. So we may find that, and that would be awesome. There are some other things that we're looking at in terms of antibiotics. There are right now very broad spectrum antibiotics, and they are finding more and more that there are ways to get targeted antibiotics, so they can actually just take out the bad guys rather than taking out everybody. Some of those are coming from bacteria themselves. Most antibiotics actually come from bacteria. Bacteria fight each other, and that's one of the tools that your good microbiota does to fight off the pathogens, is to excrete these antibiotics. They're called bacteriocins. They're more targeted. They are actually usually for the cousins of the good guys. So a lot of the bad guys are very similar to the good guys. They just are off by a few genes here and there, and that makes them bad. But the good guys can kill them on their own. So these bacteriocins may be a future direction for more targeted action, where you could actually, right now, antibiotics are considered bad in the sense of screwing up your microbiota. We could look at them in the future as being very well targeted and wonderful to put your microbiota back in balance. There's also something called phage therapy, and phages are something that are actually viruses that attack bacteria, and they're very specific as well. So we may be able to design phages that could go in and wipe out the bad bacteria. The nice thing about phages is that because they're viruses, as long as you've got bad bacteria, they'll keep reproducing and destroying the bad bacteria. So it's not like you need to have continuous doses of this all the time. With antibiotics, you might need to be on the antibiotics for a couple of weeks. But with phages, you would just get one treatment, and they would scoot through your system and find all the bad guys and kill them on the spot.
Wow.
So that's another possible thing for the future. I don't know, one of the best things I would look forward to is just education. I hope I'm a part of helping people to understand that a lot of what we consider to be our personality is actually centered in our gut. And that with that knowledge, with the knowledge of what the source of some of the distress is, I think that we can learn a lot better to get over the stigma of depression and anxiety. If in fact depression is caused a lot by bacteria, well, there's no more reason to have stigma about that than when you have the flu. So that I think would also be very helpful. It would make people, I think it would help people to come out of the woodwork a little bit. Men in particular tend to treat depression with alcohol, and that actually doesn't really help very much, and often exacerbates the situation. But if they understood that it was something that was, just a force of nature, bacteria coming in and getting you, then they would hopefully be able to look at that as something that wasn't an unpleasant mental problem, but rather something that was just affecting their mind, that was in their gut. So those are a few of the things that I see in the future. And I'm pretty excited about all that.
Yeah, I've got to say, especially from this mental health perspective, there is a lot of emphasis on encouraging people to change the diet, change the lifestyle. And I just know from experience talking to people that this idea of, if someone's in the depths of depression and someone's saying, change your diet, start eating salads and stuff like that, it doesn't land, it doesn't hit home. It sounds this idea of changing your diet, it sounds very vague and sort of airy-fairy. But I think once you include this aspect of it, the bacterial aspect, it throws some extra weight behind the argument and just makes it sound that little bit more convincing. I think there's definitely a disconnect there conceptually with this idea of food affecting the mind. This sort of Cartesian duality, I guess. People don't see the way that diet affects the brain and the mind. But like I say, when you throw this idea of psychobiotics and the gut microbiota in there, it adds a certain amount of weight to it that I think might convince a lot of people to take that step with a lifestyle change. So I think I think it's very hopeful, quite a powerful message. So
yeah, and I would not claim that all kinds of depression and all kinds of anxiety. There are lots of causes. There are lots of reasons why people are depressed, but it definitely seems to be true that if your gut is dysbiotic, if it's messed up and if it's leaking and if you're having chronic inflammation, that is going to be a definite negative in your mental health.
Yeah,
it may not cure you to fix it, but it's certainly going to make things better. It seems to make things better in general. So the psychobiotic theory at least gives you something to look at. It gives you sort of a guideline. What should I do with my life to make things better if, in fact, microbes are controlling me? And how do I make my microbes better? And when I do, how do I keep track of that? And everybody's personalized. Everybody's different. People have different food allergies. People have all sorts of differences. So it's one of those things where this tool is very helpful, but then you need to kind of get on top of it, pay attention to what's working, what's not working, take notes, and see what's actually working. And in our book, we include a little quiz. It's not really a quiz, but just a questionnaire, a simple questionnaire, so that you can monitor your depression as you try different approaches. So I do think it gives us a marvelous handle. I don't think it cures everything in the world, but I think it gives us a marvelous handle for us to take better control of our own lives.
Yeah. Right, okay, Scott, it's time for the quickfire round that I subject everybody to at the end of these interviews. Firstly, well, the usual question is, do you have any book recommendations on this topic? But of course, this is based on your forthcoming book, so feel free to take a moment to plug away at that, please.
Well, sure. The Psychobiotic Revolution is the name that National Geographic gave to the book. I think it's a good title, although we're a little worried that people are not acquainted with what psychobiotics are, and it might sound frightening, but they are similar to psychoactive drugs in the sense that they are biotics that will affect your mentation, your mood. It's with John Cryin and Ted Dinan, two geniuses from Ireland who have coined the term psychobiotic. So they kind of own the field in a sense. They've done a lot of research. There are other people doing research in this area, Rob Knight, Jack Gilbert, Sarkis Mazmanian. These people have all done some amazing research. That research is represented in the book as well. The book takes you through a kind of, since it was National Geographic, I felt that we had to give you a voyage. So I take you on a little trip through your intestines, sort of like you're in a canoe as you go through the dark waters of the guts, and following that through so that you can see at what points bacteria are impacting your brain. So that's kind of a fun National Geographic sort of thing, following the wild bacteria through your gut. And We show a little bit of the history, and then we talk a lot about how the connections work. What are all the ways that microbes can talk to your brain? That's absolutely fascinating. It's also at the cutting edge of everything. So we may find out that there are more ways to talk, and in fact, we are finding more ways every day. But that kind of a connection is very useful to people to, kind of monitor what's going on and to have an idea of what they need to do to fix things. We also list a bunch of bacterial formulations. So we look at various probiotics. We look at things including yogurt and various other types of prebiotics and probiotics. And we give you an idea of which one of them you can trust, because most of them have not been studied at all. And in a study that Nature did with 19 probiotics, they found that 16 of them did not have what they stated on the label. So it's a frightening world out there when it comes to probiotics. We show you which ones actually have passed peer-reviewed studies. So that kind of gives you an idea of which ones are the best for you to use. And we talk about a lot of therapeutic things that you can do. The book is definitely, unabashedly trying to be a do-it-yourself guide to help people deal with their depression. We're not guaranteeing that everybody's depression is going to get cured, but we are saying that the odds that you will feel better after doing this are very high. And that we're seeing in spades. We're seeing that with people already who have started in previews of the books, who are taking the advice to heart and who are feeling much better. I'm kind of astonished to see how well some of this stuff works with some of my friends and some of the reviewers of the book. So that's the Psychobiotic Revolution, coming out November 7th from National Geographic. And we're all very excited to finally get this book in the bookstores.
Yep. Available for pre-order now on Amazon, as far as I know.
If you pre-order it, you can get $8 off.
Oh,
so,
that sounds good.
Yeah, I totally recommend it.
Yeah, well, I will include a link in the show notes for people to go straight to that. Okay, so let's try and rush through these now. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?
Well, the government puts out a food pyramid, and the food pyramid is actually created by the USDA. The USDA doesn't know anything about depression or your mind or your body or your health. It is strictly for growers. It's for agricultural people. It is trying to push whatever it is we're growing. I would banish that. It needs to be based on, it needs to not come from the USDA, from the Department of Agriculture. It needs to come from the Department of Health. It needs to come from the NIH or something like that. And we need more studies. We don't have enough studies to make a good decision. The original food pyramid came from politicians who basically said, look, you scientists are saying that you don't know enough to make a decision, but I'm a politician. We have to make a decision whether it's right or wrong. Well, we need to stop that kind of nonsense. Stop letting politicians figure out what is healthy and what is not. They need to back off, and they need to let the scientists do their job. At the same time, it needs to be understood that the difficulty of human studies is not to be underestimated. It is very, very hard to get humans to just do what you want to do for any extended period of time. We may have to do things like studies in jails where you actually may be able to control people's diet. And of course, I would make that all voluntary. But there are some ideas that we could pursue that could help us. But we need to start putting things back on a scientific footing and kind of get away from the idea that all we have to do is serve the agricultural business, because that is what has led us to the pasture that we have today. So I think that would be one of the biggest things, would be to get the USDA out of our food planning. What,
if anything, keeps you up at night?
I sleep quite well because I eat my yogurt. I actually have had in the past, I did have depression, and a lot of it had to do with super bad diet. And so I have fixed a lot of that. But I still worry about, I worry a lot about things like antibiotics and things. I get calls. This is one of the most important things that I get calls on is a friend will call up and say, well, Scott, you said that we shouldn't be using antibiotics and our child has this problem and she needs antibiotics. And I say, well, give her the antibiotics. I'm not your doctor, but if you are going to give them antibiotics, at least give them some yogurt to try and repopulate their gut. So that's one of the things that we're doing is trying to figure out a way to not stop antibiotics because they are miracle drugs, but to realize that antibiotics have side effects. That's what kind of bothers me the most is that doctors seem to think that there are no side effects to antibiotics, but they are there and they're serious and they're going to change your life perhaps forever. And so getting back on track after an antibiotic treatment is very, very important. It's one of those things that doesn't keep me up as often as it keeps my friends up who are calling me about this one all the time. Everybody is getting antibiotics and it's willy-nilly and they're getting them whether it's going to help them or not because we have always assumed there was no downside. So make sure that if you're getting antibiotics that you actually have a bacterial problem that can be solved that way. That it's not a virus that wouldn't be helped by antibiotics in the first place. So that's about the only thing that kind of bothers me is just the lack of education of basic nutrition by doctors. They don't know anything about the microbiota and they don't know anything about nutrition. And that's just not a part of their curricula when they are studying medicine. It's just not there. So I kind of get frightened by that lack of curiosity or that lack of education on the medical side.
What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Life advice?
Yeah. Apart from eat your yogurt.
Well, I don't know. I've gotten a lot of good advice over the years, mostly telling me to to stay chipper. And I'm not sure that's the best advice because, as you say, a lot of people, if you're depressed in particular, you get that a lot. Why don't you just be happy? I think that a lot of the best advice that I've been getting is lately from John and Ted, reading what they're doing. And for me, understanding that the microbiota is so central to so many aspects of our health, including being overweight, including our health. We can probably extend our health span by decades if we got better at understanding how the microbes work. So just in terms of life and how to be happier, I think that we need to look deeper into these microbes. And I think that advice to look at microbes has been a life changer for me.
What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
I fall off the wagon. I think my biggest problem is that I still want to have certain foods that are forbidden. And it's honestly, it's very difficult living in the Western world. It's difficult to go to the store and buy something that doesn't have something that's sneakily and insidiously designed to make you want to consume a whole bag of Cheetos or something. So I fall back on an occasion, and that gives me a lot of grief. And then we're living in America in the age of Trump, so there's a little bit of extra stress involved with life. Sometimes I might have one glass too many of wine. So that's one of the things that we should all be watching, especially men who are depressed and seem to self-medicate with alcohol. So that's one of the things to look out for.
Is the increase in drinking alcohol as a direct result of the Trump presidency?
I have a feeling that the alcohol companies love Donald Trump.
Okay. What part of your career are you most proud of?
I think my writing. I have been a scientist on and off throughout the years, but I write. I love to demystify some of the heavy-duty science that's out there. The science is now so hard to understand that a biochemist can't understand what a biophysicist is writing. Even though they seem to be related, they have a different language. And so nobody really is understanding what's going on. We have people who are such good experts at such a small thing that they end up knowing more and more about less and less until finally they know everything about nothing. And the idea that all of that information could be there and be right out in front of us, but not understandable, is crazy to me. So I've kind of taken it on as my duty as a human being to translate what the science journals are saying into something that can actually be useful for people. I think people don't have any idea of how useful science is in their life. I know we all are very familiar with how great it is to watch a football game, but I don't think we have any idea of how great it is to understand a science article. The people that are the real heroes to me are the scientists. They are just toiling in anonymity and speaking a language nobody can understand. So that's the thing that makes me proudest, is the work that I've done in making stem cells easier to understand and making computer technology easier to understand, and now trying to get psychobiotics to be easier to understand.
That's a great answer. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Absolutely writing. When I'm working as a scientist, I get paid okay, decent, but when I'm working as a writer, I hardly get paid at all. And yet, that's the thing that is much more, by far the most exciting thing that I do. When I can look at my shelf and see the books that I've written up there, and then I look at some of the letters people have written to me, telling me how it changed their life, that is everything. That there's nothing that can beat that.
Okay, last but not least, what do you think is the key to happiness?
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know exactly. I know that for sure there's keys to sadness, and one of those keys is to abuse yourself, and we abuse ourselves without even knowing it half the time. So stop abusing yourself and you will be a lot happier. I think that we overthink a lot of stuff, in some sense. In another sense, I think we underthink things. It's like we don't really care too much about science, but I think science is one of those things that can make people happy. I think that when I look at a newspaper and I see, who has shot who, and I look at what wars are going on and how people are starving, it's depressing as hell. And then you look at a science article and you realize, oh my God, these guys have just cured a new disease. It's like, that's really where the excitement is in the world, but nobody looks at it. So I'm a little confused about that. I know that we need to know what's going on in the rest of the world, but I can tell you that there are happy stories that come out of science, and that's maybe the only place where happy stories come from. And that's sad, but seems to be the case.
Okay, Scott, this has been a very interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Have you got any links you'd like to recommend to the listeners? Are you on social media? Again, feel free to plug away.
I'm on Twitter at Psychobiotic.
Okay. Any websites or anything?
Yes, I have a website, but I'm afraid to let it out just yet. But if you go to Twitter and you go to @Psychobiotic, as soon as that website is available, I will send people there.
Okay, sounds good. Scott Anderson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. It was great.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, actually, for those of you who didn't enjoy this episode, you guys can bugger off and skip this bit because it doesn't apply to you. But if you did enjoy this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could blast out a little mention on social media saying, yeah, check this knobhead out, he's actually pretty good. You could like our Facebook page or leave us a review there, even better. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop up. You could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. It's always a nice way of encouraging new listeners to give us a whirl. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous and you feel that this podcast is genuinely adding some value and you'd like to support it in a more long-term sense, then you can become a subscriber for as little as £1 a month, or you could just make a one-off donation, again, for as little as £1. So, yeah, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support, but only if you can afford it, and, you know, no donations from stolen credit cards either, please. Can't be arsed with that hassle. So, yeah, plenty of things to keep you busy there while I go busy myself putting the next episode together. So, in the meantime, as I always say, behave yourselves, but not too much, and I'll see you again next time.